Shinran's concept of other power. Shinran, like Honen, repudiated the entire framework of the debate over once calling and many calling. His basic position is clear in his emphasis on the word even, which appears in the crucial phrases even 10 times and even once in the larger sutra, for he stresses that even is used in order to express the indeterminateness of the number of utterances of the name. There is no set number of times the name should be said, for the validity of the Nembutsu arises from beyond any act of man. Thus, criticism of those who say it only once or who say it repeatedly is simply beside the point. Although the two antagonistic positions of once calling and many calling were largely shaped by their attacks on the opposite extreme, Shinran and Honen were able to affirm the significance of both from a broader perspective, based upon the working of other power. Shinran's stance, however, differs from that of Honen and such fellow disciples as Saikaku and Ryukan, although they also teach that the proper number of utterances is undetermined. This difference arises from Shinran's profound self-reflection, which made it necessary for him to confront the deeply rooted and intractable elements of self-attachment within his own Nembutsu practice. For Honen, the Nembutsu was the path of other power because it depended on the merits accumulated in eons of practice by Bodhisattva Dharmakara, and not man's own limited, defiled practice. With the Nembutsu, a person does not seek to gain merit by performing practices, but partakes of the Buddha's merits embodied in the name simply by saying it. By itself, however, uttering the Nembutsu is merely another traditional self-power practice and of no special consequence. It can bring about birth only through the working of Amida's vow to save all beings. Thus, for Honen, two elements are essential: entrusting oneself to the power of the vow and saying the name, and he summed up his teaching as just saying the name without any doubt that one will thus attain birth through the vow. Just saying the name was expressed more technically as Senju Nembutsu, or single practice of saying the name, with single stressing devotion to the Nembutsu only and rejection of all other forms of good on the basis of Amida's critical selection. Faith in the vow gives impulse to each utterance in the present moment, for it recognizes that a single utterance embodies countless virtues. Nevertheless, since it is the utterance that is crucial as the means for receiving the Buddha's virtues and attaining birth at the point of death, saying the name is naturally repeated from moment to moment and continues to the end of one's life. In single practice, then, practice retains the sense of repetitive training common to the traditional Buddhist ways. On this basis, Honen and some of his followers confronted the dispute over once calling and many calling by teaching a synthesis of the two positions, holding that while each single utterance of the name suffices in itself to bring about birth, the practicer should continue saying the name throughout his life. Saikaku, for example, writes, quote, "Though one utterance suffices as the act for birth, some may think that it is important to accumulate more and more merit while passing their days and nights, and so they recite the Nembutsu day and night, and the merit increases more and more, and the cause for birth becomes even more determined." Close quote. Shinran sought to follow Honen's teaching and say the name with sincere faith in the vow, but as he probed deeply into his own practice of the Nembutsu, he was forced to recognize that it was defiled at its core. Quote, "In all small and foolish beings, at all times, thoughts of greed and desire incessantly defile any goodness of heart. Thoughts of anger and hatred constantly consume the Dharma treasure. Even if one urgently acts and urgently practices as though sweeping fire from one's head, all these acts must be called poisoned and sundry good, and false and deceitful practice. They cannot be called true and real action. To seek to be born in the land of immeasurable light through such false and poisoned good is completely wrong." Close quote. Just saying the name appears to be easy when compared with other Buddhist practices. But when it is done without sincere and trusting, it cannot lead to birth in the Pure Land, for it is essentially an act of self-power. Moreover, Shinran found that to utter the name with complete trust, having freed oneself of all impulse to achieve birth for oneself and all clinging to one's own worthiness, is near impossible. The Nembutsu as easy practice, which had been established out of self-reflection on man's incapacity to accomplish any other practice, takes on a paradoxical difficulty, for it seems to demand a condition of heart and mind that further self-reflection shows impossible to attain. For Shinran, then, the central problem in saying the Nembutsu is not the number, constancy, or length of time, but the total entrusting of oneself to other power that it is to embody. In the context of the dilemma of faith, of the impossibility of freeing oneself from one's own self-attachment and contrivance, other power assumes a radically new meaning. According to Shinran, other power means to be free of any form of calculation concerning one's salvation. It is not merely a stock of merit apart from oneself that one can depend on to attain birth, for in that case one may make it one's own, which is self-power. Rather, Shinran found that it functions within practicers, awakening them to their own true nature as persons whose every act is poisoned by blind passions, and at the same time to the great compassion that grasps them just as they are. With this awakening, all their own efforts to make themselves deserving of Amita's compassion fall away, and they entrust themselves fully to the vow for the first time. To receive Amita's virtues, then, is to receive the Buddha's sincere mind, by which one sees oneself as one truly is, illumined by great compassion, and entrusts oneself to that compassion. Shinran expresses Amita's working as iko, or giving, which is other power giving itself to one in order to bring one to the realization of true entrusting, or shinjin, in the immediate present and the attainment of enlightenment at death. Here, Shinran's position concerning the controversy over once calling and many calling becomes clear. The advocacy of either extreme is rejected as the calculation of practicers who are laboring in self-power, seeking to assume an attitude of spirit they believe necessary, and making the utterance of Amita's name their own act of good. When persons experience great compassion, they are freed of all calculation and all effort to achieve birth for themselves, and out of this awakening, the utterance of the name emerges naturally. This is the true meaning of once calling. Thus, Shinran redefines Honen's concept of single practice, shifting emphasis from the practice of saying the name to the entrusting of oneself to Amita's vow. Quote, to entrust oneself wholeheartedly to the vow of birth through the Nembutsu and be single-hearted is called the wholehearted single practice. Close quote. Moreover, the other power that works in a person to bring him or her to this realization of Shinjin continues to manifest itself in the saying of the name, not as a means for attaining birth, which has already become certain in the first thought moment of Shinjin, but out of deep gratitude for the Buddha's compassion. This is the true meaning of many calling.